Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Welcome back to another episode of American Medieval. I am delighted to be joined by our guest this week, Sarah E. Bond, who is the Erling B. Jack Holtzmark Associate Professor in the Classics and Associate Professor in History at the University of Iowa. And that is a mouthful, but it is deserved every bit of it. So welcome, Sarah.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and it's nice to hang out.
Yes, it is great. It's again, like, I feel with some of these introductions, it's always a little weird and stilted because like we've known each other for a long time, and it's always like here's a formal introduction instead of like, hey, how's it going? What's up? But the genre dictates.
I feel kind of embarrassed by the whole introductory performance, but it is necessary to try and get to know people. I just also think that certainly people should always feel welcome to email me or talk to me or follow me on Blue Sky, and I will talk to them like a regular person and not require them to spit out the entirety of my work title.
Yes, that is entirely the case with almost every academic that you will encounter. Not all of them, I will say, of course, right? There are some that are not quite as approachable as others that, sometimes even to our colleagues. But anyway, we don't have to talk about that. Well, maybe we'll get to that at the end, after I finish drinking whatever I have in front of me right now, which you can't see, but, you can use your imagination. Anyway, so as we're starting off this podcast, I have come up with kind of maybe a silly question, so I hope you'll kind of indulge me as we get our conversation going. And it's about time machines. Because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that every historian or anybody who kind of thinks about or studies the past, they have kind of a complicated relationship with time machines. Like they think about them, or at least it comes up in conversations sometimes. So for the purposes of this question, indulge me. There is a time machine. We have it right here. It has been presented to you, Sarah Bond, and you have to go back in time to visit a childhood Sarah Bond and tell them that someday you will grow up to be a professional historian. What does young Sarah say to that news?
She says that she wants to be a paleontologist, and what happened to the dinosaurs? I was always very into excavation and digging, and my father took me to various gorges in Virginia while we were growing up to see fossils, and I live nearby a Devonian gorge here, which we love taking our children to. Mm-hmm. But I was obsessed with paleontology, as many young kids were. And then as I got older, I started taking Latin when I was 14 in the Roanoke City public school systems. They allowed us to start taking Latin pretty young. Mm-hmm. And so I switched to archaeology from paleontology.
Okay, so still dirt stuff.
Still want to get dirty, still want to have a trowel, still want to wear a fedora of some sort, even though that's really not my style. Mm-hmm. But then I got to the University of Virginia, and I shifted and started looking more at the integration of material culture into history. And my undergraduate advisor, Elizabeth Meyer, introduced me to epigraphy, which is to say the study of inscriptions. And as I became more interested in material culture and written material culture like papyri, ostraca, and inscriptions, I began to see that ancient history really allows us to bring together a lot of different sources of evidence to tell a story. And so I excavated many seasons while I was an undergraduate, but ultimately I left the dinosaurs behind, and I left the dead Sicilians behind that I worked on, as well as a bunch of other sites that I had worked to excavate or to oversee or to map. And I decided to be an ancient historian. But yes, I think 6 or 7-year-old Sarah would be very surprised that I no longer play fast pitch softball, and I and I don't work out in Montana or out in
Yeah.
the West somewhere. And certainly Jurassic Park came out when I was still pretty young.
Okay.
And that was the first ringtone I ever had on my phone.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, I remember when you used to be able to clip like the sound things and use them as ringtones. Like this is dating us, right? But
yes.
yeah, like when that kind of John Williams score kind of swells in the Jurassic Park thing, I remember that echoing like everywhere around me with ringtones for a brief moment there. So
I listened to that soundtrack nonstop. It was definitely the soundtrack to, well, my life until we got Columbia House Records. And then it was predominantly a lot of mid 90s pop. So.
yes. So those mail-in records. I mean, there's a whole kind of nostalgia thing we could talk about there. So I do have to ask you before we move on, a favorite dinosaur?
I would say Triceratops, which of course is
This is the correct answer.
because The
Mm-hmm.
Land Before Time came out when I was a child, and of course the Triceratops name was Sarah, and we all know, right, that this is coming from the Latin for horn, like
Mm-hmm.
3 horns, tricera. But of course, I love the homonym and I like puns a lot. So I really bonded with the Triceratops in Jurassic Park and the Triceratops from Land Before Time because I would go to Pizza Hut and I would get the puppets from Land Before Time because my parents would take me to Pizza Hut because, again, I am from Appalachia and that is what we did on the weekends.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I grew up in
So,
upstate New York, and like that's what Pizza Hut was that was like
yeah.
family meal on the weekends, right? And
Yeah. Personal pan pizzas are wonderful. Plus, in the summertime, when you read enough books, you get a free one.
the reading thing, absolutely. I mean, like encouraged a generation to be
That's
readers.
right.
Was that free pan
Yeah.
pizza that was waiting for you at the end?
Pizza Hut and Dolly Parton are the 2 great motivators to reading
Yeah.
in the modern world.
Yes, and vaccines for that matter. I mean, Dolly's kind of everywhere,
Mm.
and she's kind of a modern saint in many ways. So
Oh, I think she'll be beatified. Yeah. She will probably get a halo at some point.
she will absolutely. So at least in pop culture, and I don't know, like maybe if Leo sticks around, like hopefully Dolly will be around for a long time. But if Leo's still here as our first American pope, then maybe he'll make a little exception for Dolly.
Yes.
So yeah,
My students like it when I call him Big Papa. So
Big Papa. I mean,
yeah.
accurate, right? So. Triceratops, great dinosaur, always my favorite as well. I don't know, there was something just kind of something cool about like the head shield and the 3 horns and something like that. I didn't have any kind of Latin behind it or pun or anything like that. So I just thought he looked cool. And the Tyrannosaurus, like because they're always pictured like fighting.
Yes.
The Tyrannosaurus and the Triceratops, and the Tyrannosaurus always just seemed so mean, and the Triceratops was like sticking up for himself. So that's what attracted me.
I mean, raptors are just too scary. When I'm alone in a kitchen, I still get a little bit of anxiety.
Oh, the Velociraptors. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
I still think about when I'm in big industrial kitchens, I think about that scene a lot. So pop culture does quite a number on people when they say, "Oh, does it bother you that Gladiator 1 or Gladiator 2 was inaccurate?" It doesn't bother me so much as I know that it deeply imprints on our students a certain narrative that is very hard to shake because it is formative to the way that we grow up is consuming pop culture.
Yeah. I think that all scholars oftentimes have a very complicated relationship with pop culture as well, right? Because it does get them in the classroom oftentimes, right? Like, I mean, I remember, this is how old I am, right? Like the Da Vinci Code with Dan Brown,
Yes.
right? Like just a surge in interest in the Middle Ages, for example, because of, how popular Dan Brown was. And then, of course, the Game of Thrones phenomenon and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then we have to do work, as you're saying, to kind of divest people of these clearly fictional and fantasy elements about how our periods are constructed. And so do you have any go-to things, like if somebody comes, because Gladiator 2 was just out just a little while ago, I'm sure you've confronted this, like was there something that you could kind of go to talk through people and get them out of that and back to the actual past?
I think that gateway drugs that are pop culture, I think, and that lead you into looking into various time periods are wonderful. And it's just knowing the difference between the reality and the myth that is so important. But even then, it continues to come back, whether you know or not, that pop culture is oftentimes going to replace even what you've taught them. And so one method for me is simply to have students do film reviews in class that talk about the historical review and then the enjoyment review, that we write reviews for a lot of different reasons and in a lot of different ways. And I ask them to oftentimes review Gladiator 1, and then I took all my students to Film Scene, which is our local movie theater, in order to watch Gladiator 2, and then they had to do reviews that specifically talked about historical inaccuracy. But then another review that was simply about the narrative, about the enjoyment and the consumption, because I want them to think of Gladiator 2 as a fiction. And when I try and undo the fact, for instance, in Gladiator 1, that Commodus does not kill Marcus Aurelius, he doesn't suffocate him with a pillow, that Marcus Aurelius dies of plague. And we don't know exactly all of the specifics of it, but we know that what Joaquin Phoenix does is pulling along a story and telling a good narrative that is extremely successful. I love watching Gladiator 1, but having them write down and commit in their own hand to separating the wheat from the chaff, maybe, is one way that I have found in order to try and get them to see that it is okay to tell a wonderful story, but at the same time, we want to understand how that has a huge impact on our understanding of the past as well, and that it can oftentimes feed into things that we are not fully aware of, like fascist imagery that takes Trump's head and circumimposes it onto Maximus's body, as we saw on January 6th, that this idea of Maximus, who was never a person, is a composite of a bunch of different figures, but was not an actual historical figure, that Maximus becomes so real in the imaginary worlds that are created online and that are created in many people's heads, that when they are looking for a historical hero, because they don't necessarily know enough about Roman antiquity, they reach to what is most familiar, which is Maximus, and superimposing Trump's face onto him. So it's never always headed in that direction. I mean, it's not always a bad thing, but it can become something that is negative and dangerous.
And it's not, like these pop culture evocations or these political uses of the past are never the logical conclusion, but they are a logical conclusion from the way these things are used. Like, they're a possibility there.
Reception can go in so many different ways, and that is the excitement about reception, is that you are taking it and recycling it and turning it into something that is new or something that references the past while moving forward into the future. And reception is something that is endlessly fascinating, but it can be used for good or bad, or just mid, just
just uninteresting,
uninteresting
TikTok memes or something like that.
It's a whole spectrum of different things. It's not inherently negative. You're exactly right.
I did want to go back to something you said for a minute, though, because I'm curious, is that because this is something that obviously anybody who studies kind of the pre-modern world generally kind of confronts, I think. You said something to the effect of, like, because people don't know the actual Roman past, this kind of fills that gap. Is that one way to get at it, is just kind of more better kind of public history in these spaces, or maybe not public history, but publicly accessible history in these spaces? Or do you think there's something else kind of going on in its place? And I'm a little bit off base here.
I think that more outreach, more engagement, things like podcasts, but also more TV shows are extremely helpful. One thing that really concerns me is the defunding of NPR and of PBS, because some of the best programming on Roman history that we've seen in the past 50 years has come through PBS miniseries and Nova and many other documentaries that take on important topics, because as we both know, the History Channel is for aliens, World War II, and Nazis. And that's not going to be a place that I would turn to in order to get what we might call true history, or closer to the veritable truth. But all of these outlets are providing important information that is vetted and gone through what we might call peer review in various ways. And one problem with YouTube history, or with a lot of historians that are on TikTok as well, is that they are writing their own scripts and then they are publishing them without any other pair of eyes or ears having gone through and fact checked them. So you read the New Yorker has a huge team of fact checkers that go through everything, the invisible peer review that we never see through newspapers, filtered through PBS and through news channels. Those are expensive. And
Yeah.
yesterday we saw a number of women of color fired from Teen Vogue, for instance. So a lot of the major journalists who are trained in fact checking, in reading, in speaking to historians and speaking accessibly, especially to young people, a lot of those journalists are being fired. And a lot of the replacements that we have are people that are looking to make money through YouTube or looking to monetize it. And sometimes they may not be as accurate as we want them to be. So I don't want to discourage this type of public history. I just think people need to be aware that part of what we want are more levels of review of content prior to publication rather than this instantaneous creation of content.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's always, I think that one of the things that distinguishes the way that most public historians or most historians who think about kind of engagement with the public beyond kind of smaller academic circles is it's not necessarily about a degree, but it is about kind of rigor and methodology and being clear that you're being honest about the past. And you're pointing to a real kind of danger, right? Is that with instantaneous social media, sometimes that can get, millions of views very, very quickly. Things can go viral. There's no way that sometimes these people are actually accurate or even trying to be accurate in the presentation of the past. I mean, I deal with this in my own research with the Crusades all the time. Like a lot of the garbage that's on YouTube, which most of it is garbage. I mean, if you look at kind of the most viewed videos, it's just polemicists and, they're presenting it in an academic sounding way, but it's not actually kind of rigorous in any real sense.
Yeah, and I write a lot of publicly accessible history, and not all of it is
an amazing newsletter, among other
yeah,
things.
well, thank you very much. But I think that a lot of the content that you and I and many other people are creating oftentimes gets repurposed into TikTok videos and YouTube. And sometimes they cite us and sometimes they don't. And I think one way that viewers and listeners can really check to see if what they are consuming is accurate is in part with understanding that saying the citations or listing the citations either in a podcast or online or even just speaking in reference, as Matt Gabriel says, right? All of these are indicators that this person is perhaps a little bit more rigorous and really engaging with the scholarship that is important in the moment. I think this metric of citation, does this person mention other people, is a good way of testing to see if some of the content that you are consuming is either coming from somebody else and not really made by the creator, or if they are persons that really want to read widely in order to create their scripts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, not to sound too clickbaity, right? But I am trying to sell a podcast here, basically. So I will be a little bit clickbaity. Is that, the one quick trick to understanding if somebody is really telling the truth is not being a sage on the stage, right? Not just kind of expounding, but realizing and understanding that the process of any humanistic scholarship, but historical scholarship, for example, is a collaborative process. Like, I don't just know things about the past. I read lots of other people who have written about the past in order to understand these things. And then I put them together and create kind of a synthesis or something like that in my own work. But I'm always really, we're always really dependent upon the work of people, not just in our immediate environment, but dating back centuries in many cases.
Absolutely. We can't do this by ourselves. I mean, part of the reason I wrote a whole book on collective action, in part, is because in the field of Roman history, but also in the field of what we call digital humanities, which is to say just digital approaches to different types of humanities subjects, that we're constantly working together. And that's not just edited volumes. If we're making a map, you can't see that the topographical map that we're making has, well, the Barrington Atlas, for instance, which is our standard atlas for the ancient world, has 300 contributors that help to make one atlas. list. And their names are all listed at the end. But at the same time, you're just looking at a map and you cannot see all the different hands, all the different people that checked locations, all the people that checked elevations. And it's important that those people become visible. And it's important that we point out when we cherry pick and when we appropriate or use from other people, because history is just a constant revision. That's all it is. But it's a constant revision with citation.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I would encourage all of my listeners to do this, when you pick up a book, read the acknowledgments first.
Yes.
You know, I think those are really revealing and really interesting. And those people need, because oftentimes a lot of kind of hidden work is made visible there, sometimes in really disturbing ways, and other times, and most times, hopefully, in much more productive ways. I did want to switch, though, because you mentioned, you know, collective action and your recent book, Strike, which is out now. It's a really fabulous book. But now, I am a simple medievalist, and I'm not an ancient historian, so bear with me as I ask this perhaps naive question. I was under the impression that only emperors and gladiators lived in ancient Rome, but you're telling me in this book that that's not true.
That is true. I prefer history from below. There's 60 million people within the Roman Mediterranean at its height. And I'm really much more interested in the regular day-to-day artisans and craftspeople. But the people that get the most fanfare, the people that get the most books written about them, are certainly emperors and people that we would call within the 1.5%, because most of the economic historians working today have calculated that the highest levels, that is to say senators and another grade that we call equestrians, these are the wealthiest people within the Roman Empire generally, they make up about 1.5% of the entirety, as opposed to like in Occupy Wall Street when they called us the 99%, you know?
Yeah.
Right now, Roman inequality levels, how we measure this is something called the Gini coefficient. We're pretty close to the Roman inequality Gini coefficient from antiquity today within the United States. So
fantastic. So great. Love that.
We actually, in many places, are falling behind the Roman Empire. We are more unequal in many areas. So I think that one place that we can cross-compare between Rome and today is the fact that hierarchies and power have a lot of meaning, and that we tend to focus much more on the wealthy on TV shows and most media in general, in the same way that we focus on emperors and gladiators from antiquity, that a very small number of people, even though gladiators were predominantly enslaved persons that were owned as chattel by emperors and by very wealthy people.
Yeah.
But they're sexy, so.
Not the poor people, right? The rich people seem to be sexy. That's what you were saying?
Yes, the rich people see the gladiators as being very sexy. Their blood oftentimes was collected and ingested. And
really?
Oh, yes. There's quite a bit of literature on gladiator blood used for magic and magical purposes. And so gladiators live in a oxymoron in that they are both heroized and also demonized, that within Roman law they have a stigma called infamia, where we get the word infamy from. And so they're technically legally infamous, and they oftentimes, if they're enslaved, are chattel property of the person that owns the gladiatorial familia, that is to say the family that they belong to. But at the same time, when they step into that amphitheater, they're the stars of the arena. And they live a kind of double life, that they are both celebrated and demonized at the same time. And that's why they're also very liminal, kind of dangerous figures as well within history. But gladiators have been sensationalized and very much lifted up as heroes really since about the 19th century, and a little bit before within especially Europe with Spartacus.
Yeah. No, you made reference a couple times to kind of enslaved people within the Roman world, right? And I think that that's also something that kind of gets lost, is the fact that the empire, the Roman Empire was a slave state, that slaves powered the economy in a lot of ways. And, one of the things I think your book does really well, it excavates, if you will, archaeology and paleontology reference, totally intended, is that, it shows, kind of the ways that these people function and the ways that they kind of interact and the place that they held in Roman society.
I think that remembering that chattel slavery means that individuals are bought and sold as property, and that they are treated as such is something that is very important to this meme of lifting up the Roman Empire and thinking about it every
Mm-hmm.
day. Because what parts of Rome are you thinking about is another important question that
Yep.
we have to ask ourselves. Because enslaved persons is my focus in a lot of the work that I write and I publish, and freed persons are individuals who are manumitted. And within the Italian peninsula, about 20 to 25% of all people, that is to say, 1 in 5 or 1 in 4, depending on the time period, are enslaved persons owned
Mm-hmm.
by another person. And a lot of my students have this idea that Roman slavery must have been kinder, that it was the good slave and the good master that was sold, especially in the 19th century, as a way for Southern slaveholders to defend what they were doing against the abolitionists, was to
Mm-hmm.
say, no, no, this is the good slave and the good master. I treat them well. And look at what we have within things like Cicero, because Cicero, the person that writes down almost all of Cicero's work, is an enslaved man named Tiro. And so we're constantly confronting slavery within the Roman world, but not fully processing how brutal of a system it truly was. And
Mm-hmm.
gladiators are a part of that slave system that's very important to compare. They're being beaten, they're being whipped, because when you are a piece of property, your dominus or domina, that is to say your master, can kill you with impunity. And
Mm-hmm.
that is something that actually happened quite frequently. And many times, extremely wealthy people own hundreds, even thousands of enslaved persons that they put to work on estates. And so the happy slave narrative is not something that I want to perpetuate, but it's still something that's very much in the zeitgeist still to defend Rome.
Sure. Yeah.
And thus, because Rome steps in so frequently as a metonym for America, also to defend American society. So that's
Yeah.
what's very dangerous, is that we have been raised from a very early age to see America as analogous to Rome, and ergo, every defense of Rome is thus oftentimes seen as a defense of America.
So is this a problem of historiography, do you think? Or is it, because we've been talking about pop culture, but I think, you mentioned kind of American slaveholders, for example, but 19th century scholarship was kind of part of this as well, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And I don't want to erase the fact that a lot of amazing Black scholars read the classics as well.
Yes.
Frederick Douglass
Mm-hmm.
had Gibbon sitting on his desk, and he also read many, many authors from antiquity, like Aristotle and Cicero. And the thing is, classics can be used for good, it can also be used for ill. And a lot of Southern slaveholders would especially read Aristotle and the idea that people are born as a
Mm.
slave, that you are
Natural slavery.
naturally
Yeah.
born.
Mm-hmm.
That this was something that became very popular within the South right before the Civil War, especially. And Thomas Jefferson read the classics, of course. So we have many people that are pulling from antiquity in order to understand, but also provide allegories and metaphors for the present. And
Yeah.
so yes, the past absolutely gets reused in especially the 18th and 19th centuries, and even in the French Revolution, they all took names from Roman antiquity
Mm-hmm.
as republicans from the late Roman Republic. They took names from these families in order to help justify their attempt to overthrow and their success in overthrowing the king. But that's an example of perhaps good reception from Roman antiquity, but it can also be used to oppress and condemn people. And that's what you see a lot of in the American South when people quote Varro or Cicero or Polybius or especially Aristotle, is that they are trying to use the foundational gravitas of classics as a way of putting other people down
Mm-hmm.
and justifying that through a text that is seen as culturally extremely valuable.
Yeah.
And so if we have imbued that text with value, we are saying that, we are putting faith in it, then using it to justify the subjugation of other people is going to carry a lot of weight. And that's what's extremely disappointing about its use. But people like W.E.B. Du Bois and many others, Edmonia Lewis, a lot of these artists and writers knew that classics was also a place and a font for goodness as well.
Howdy. If you like this podcast, weird, but if you do, you really like Join the Party, another pod in the Multitude Collective. Join the Party is an actual play podcast with tangible worlds, genre-pushing storytelling, and collaborators who actually make each other laugh. Game Master Eric, along with Amanda, Brandon, and Julia, welcome everyone to the table, from longtime TTRPG players to folks who've never touched a role-playing game before. Jump right in or marathon their completed stories. Pirates with Bugfolk, yeah, I said that right. Summer camp drama, superheroes, or you could get straight into the future medieval historian pipeline with their high fantasy campaign. So grab some headphones and join the party. Find out more at jointhepartypod.com. You know, one of the things that's interesting about this reception, as you're pointing out, like W.B. Du Bois and Douglas and stuff like that, is giving voice and actually reading the sources themselves, is not relying so much upon reception, whether it be historiographical or kind of pop culture or something like that. And so how do you excavate, you talked at the very beginning kind of about history from below. Like, how does a historian kind of do that kind of work to get at voices that our sources don't want to foreground?
This is tough. There are a lot of ways of reading against the grain, which is something that we call a post-colonial tactic for recovering people from the past, by reading primary texts, that is to say ancient texts that are written by elite people, and reading them against the grain of what they actually want to make visible. That's one tactic for recovery that people who have studied and worked with post-colonial theory have developed for many years, since the 1970s and before. But for me, how I like to hear the voices most frequently are through inscriptions and papyri.
Okay.
And so we have thousands and thousands of inscriptions from the ancient world. Many of them are epitaphs, and many of them are very simplistic commemorations of people who have died. And they oftentimes say their occupation. They oftentimes list that they had children, that their children died down to the hour they list oftentimes.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
They will say 9 years, 5 days, 3 hours. So we know that, for instance, this narrative, that lower class Romans just would expose their children and kill them, and they didn't care about children on that level, that you can begin to protest by using these types of epitaphs to say, if a baby dies within just a few months of living, but you still have gone to the trouble to create a sarcophagus and to create a resting place for this person, that to me communicates a lot of care and a lot of love. And so many of the beliefs about childhood, about people who were marginalized, that we can begin to question them through, yes, small snippets like graffiti at Pompeii or papyri, contracts that they are making with each other. And it's an imperfect science. It's making a very patchwork quilt in order to try and understand their lives. But I think we've provided the dignity to emperors of understanding their lived experience and their psychology. Endlessly, we go back and forth arguing about whether Nero actually was bipolar, maybe, or perhaps that he wasn't that bad, as a New British Museum exhibition a few years ago began to rehabilitate Nero a little bit more. We've given endless debates to these very few people, but we haven't given the dignity of understanding the lived experience to as many artisans and craftspeople, enslaved persons, and people that we call from below, but really are the majority.
Yeah, and I think it's just such a pernicious, harmful myth about childhood, especially, is about that pre-modern people just did not care about children, which is just, the evidence is just so overwhelming that they did. They cared very, very deeply. But part of the ways that you can prove it, as I think you're saying, right, is expanding the source base, is looking at other sources, because there's a vast quantity of stuff that's out there, right? Like in material culture, going back to what you said at the very beginning, for example, but also just, other types of written texts that are there. And if you read them, if you actually pay attention to them, they tell you quite a different story about people who are oftentimes kind of marginalized or silenced within kind of more mainstream or more classical canonical texts, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, when I talk to a lot of my students about whether they can name any woman from antiquity that wrote anything other than Sappho, most of them cannot name another woman. But if you look at the inscriptions, if you look at the poetry, if you look at the statues of Memnon within Egypt that have thousands of graffiti written by both men and women, then you begin to see that the world that we have populated and the world that we have created for the Romans is predominantly male and predominantly very elite. But once we open up the source base and begin to think a little bit more about children and women and people whose literacy may not be 100%, but could still write their name and could still write a graffito on a wall in Pompeii, then we're starting to see a landscape that is much more populated with people that are living their day-to-day lives, going to the baths and then going to have a nice dinner and sitting on couches, or perhaps they are the persons that are serving the people that are having a nice dinner. But we have to populate our Roman world with all types of people. We can't just choose the 1.5% to be visible and everybody else serve as furniture.
Yeah. I like the way you said it about kind of populating the world, because it's a really empty way of thinking about the past if you're just thinking about that top really, small slice, 1.5% of the world or something like that.
And why do you care so much about the New Testament and the book of Acts? You're willing to populate the Roman Empire with Christians. Might I add that if you're going to look at lower class Christians and the early roots of Christ followers as depicted in the New Testament, then you have to provide that to the Jews, to individuals who are worshiping Mithras, that Christians aren't the only ones that are living in Ephesus, right? Ephesus, when Paul goes there to visit, is populated by silversmiths and is populated by bakers and by women and slaves. And so when you think about the world of the New Testament, you then can't also make the mistake of then privileging the Christians, because you've just moved from one privileged class to creating another privileged group. Whereas I would like to give inclusion to everybody within this world, that I'm not going to create a cultural or religious hierarchy in modernity and then subject it onto the past, which is what we oftentimes see in biblical archaeology, which is very thesis driven. And the thesis is the Bible is true.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that the Bible is true or not true, but having a thesis that you step into all literature and archaeology with is not how we function.
Yeah.
That is not how we proceed through the world. We let the evidence speak to us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think good scholarship, as you were kind of saying, like, it starts from the sources.
Right.
What are the sources saying? What are they telling us, right? Because if you go on to Safari in the past looking for something, like, you're just going to find it. Like, you're going to make it, like, you're going to go through some sort of intellectual hoops, but you're going to end up finding it and you're going to prove yourself right. But if you go and actually listen to what people in the past are saying, you might be surprised, and you're going to be more honest and more true about the past itself.
Cherry picking is very much a rhetorical endeavor. It's a rhetorical tactic that has been used since antiquity. And you can take the evidence and make it loud and put it in italics, put it in bold. But if you're omitting the rest of that evidence, that is an argument as well. And that is a rhetorical maneuver, is the omission of people and the omission of their acts and their lives is in itself very telling about the historians that are working.
Yeah.
Not just today, but yesterday as well. Because when you omit people, you are telling me as a historian that you don't care if they're erased and you don't care if they are not a part of your narrative because they didn't fit it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's certainly space, and there's important space, right, for more specialized or more narrowly focused, I should say, kind of histories, right? But they should be clear about, like, listen, I understand the problems with this, but like I'm just focusing on this.
Right. That's what the introduction is supposed to do. It's supposed to set out the
Absolutely.
scope.
Yep.
It's supposed to say, this is what I am valuing for this story alone. Maybe not in your day-to-day life, maybe not in the next book that you do, but you can lay out and say, look, this is my focus. Right now, I only want to look at Cappadocian bishops, okay?
Yeah.
And that's fine.
Yeah.
But you cannot ever study bishops or clerics without thinking about the lay people that are listening to their sermons. Who is the audience is always a question you want to ask yourself. And even if you can't see the individual lives of the lay people, you want to think about why they are speaking in that way. And so, yes, I think we can be very specific in our micro histories and in every history that we write. But I think we always have to have an eye increasingly to the fact that these groups of people are oftentimes speaking within small groups to each other in a literary manner, but then in their day-to-day lives, they're interacting with the public. And we have an onus on us. We have a burden that I'm happy to take on. That is to say, who are the people in the crowd? Who are the people listening? And what are their lives like?
Yeah, and again, that's just like very simply lived experience, right? Like what is the lived experience of the past, that the vast majority of people, even within that, like highly differentiated, within that, what I'm trying to do math as a historian, right? 98.5% of the Roman world was experiencing. That's not homogenous in any way, shape, or form, right?
Right. And Kim Bowes, who is a wonderful archaeologist at the University of Pennsylvania, her book came out today, and it's called Surviving Rome, and it's about the 90%. So even further below, taking out even the upper, what we might call the upper middle class. She removes them altogether. She's looking at what many people would call in the Middle Ages peasants. She ran a gigantic project called the Peasant Project. And so archaeologists are really at the forefront of understanding many of the lives of agricultural workers and of people who were just working in the fields. Many times they're called a colonus in my period, where we get the word colony from, because they're working in various estates for the Roman Empire. But there are many, many people who are working to recover this, and getting together at conferences and getting together and speaking to each other is wonderful. But I just really also love that they are beginning to speak to the public as well. That this book especially is written in a way that is going to be able to be accessed and read by just regular people.
Yeah, and I think those stories are really compelling to people, right? Because I think that people want to know kind of, if they are thinking about the Roman Empire, they aren't just thinking about emperors and gladiators. They are oftentimes thinking about kind of, what does the city of Rome look like? What does life in a villa look like? What does life kind of, in a smaller city or even a smaller colony, look like? People are curious about those types of questions.
That's true. And the more curiosity that people have and the more questions that they're asking specifically about these people, the more books will be created and written about them. Because if you have people that are clamoring to know more about this specifically, then I think that authors will address it.
And publishers will publish it, right?
Exactly. And so I'm not naming names. I'm just saying there are a lot of Roman historians who make a lot of money writing 14 books on Caesar. And I'm not saying that Caesar is unimportant. And we have many texts on Caesar that are extremely significant that I've taught. I've taught an entire class on Caesar's Gallic Wars, for instance. I'm not saying they aren't valuable, but do we need another book on Julius Caesar right now? And I would say no.
Yeah.
That we can democratize some of the attention economy that we have, right? Let's give attention to a few other people. And certainly there is a lot of literature coming out now that's trying to break away from only speaking about subjects that are well known to people. Do we need 14 books on Sulla? Do we need 100 on the Emperor Augustus? And the answer is simply no. Let's revisit those guys. Let's give them a timeout.
Yeah.
Let's pause this for a second and try and look elsewhere.
Yeah. To slightly awkwardly transition, another thing that kind of dominates, thinking about the ancient and in medieval world for that matter as well, is, not just Caesar, but kind of not the beginning of the empire, but the end of the empire as well, right? This period that we kind of the bane of some of our existence, this period called the fall of Rome. This also brings in, as you mentioned before, or brings in the American angle, I should say, because oftentimes when we're talking about the analogies between Rome and the American experiment, there's a million think pieces whenever anything kind of happens that's bad in the American context. Like, this is just like the fall of Rome. Here is why, we are just like the Roman Empire, and therefore these bad things that are happening are like that. This drives me insane. And I know it drives you insane as well. But why that fascination? Like, what is it about kind of this moment, sometime in the 5th century? 476 often is a year that's kind of thrown around so often. But why do you think it has such a hold on our imagination?
Well, because a lot of the foundation of schooling for even many private schools today, when they are taught Europe, when they are taught quote unquote Western civilization, which oftentimes is still a survey class that is taught in most universities. I am currently teaching a class called West in the World, but is essentially a transformed Western civilization class.
Yeah.
The idea of Western civilization began to develop, especially during the 19th century. And of course, Gibbon had written The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776, like a very important date for Americans. And it became a bestseller into the 19th century. It was still copied and reread over and over and over again. And I have my copy on my shelf as well. It's not that I haven't read Gibbon. It's simply that the narrative that we can see society crumble and that we can understand why it is imploding was very attractive to people, and that it oftentimes informed a lot of the schooling that was happening in the 19th into the 20th century, especially at the beginning of World War I, when America, and especially American politicians, wanted to encourage people to join the war. They made a lot more of an argument that we should be understanding Americans as creating continuity with Europe.
Yeah.
So this idea of Western civilization, that Americans are the people that have inherited European culture, who then Europeans inherited it from Romans and then Greeks, and then sometimes the Egyptians are incorporated into that. This idea became extremely fashionable, especially around World War I, as a way to encourage American soldiers to join. And I think the creation of that lineage, this idea that Americans are the inheritors of Roman society and culture, is something that is still very resonant within the United States. Whether or not people want to accept that, it's still very much something that creates an umbilical cord from the present back to the past.
Yeah.
And so one thing is Edward Gibbon creating a narrative that is extremely sexy and easy to follow in a very compelling manner. And the second one is simply that by we, I think many white Americans think that they can look to the past in order to prognosticate about the future. And it is very significant and important to us to divine what is going to happen. And this is a human condition that we have had since time immemorial, that we want to know the future. We want to know what will happen. And oftentimes people turn to Roman history, rightly or wrongly, usually rather inaccurately, in order to see the collapse of Rome as very much the same as many of the hardships that we're going through now within the United States. But it's an extremely imperfect analogy, and one that is reiterated over and over without thinking about a lot of the nuances and a lot of the critiques and a lot of the current research that has been done for many years within the period of late antiquity, especially from about the year 1960 forward, that we have much more knowledge of the late Roman Empire today than in 1776. But that is just the power of a compelling narrative that Gibbon gave us. I think that's really what you're seeing. But also the performance of the intelligentsia is to harken back to the past.
Yeah, so it's not, but because it's not even that Gibbon provided a compelling, and I mean, the man was a good writer. I mean,
Yeah.
let's be clear about that. Like he told, as you said, kind of a compelling story, but it wasn't just a micro history kind of about, or not a micro history, but like a smaller kind of compacted story about the fall of Rome per se. But he was also kind of suggesting, which was very fashionable at the time, this kind of meta narrative about the way that states work. Is that there's a rise, there's an apex, there's a fall, a death, and then a kind of rebirth that comes afterwards as well. And it's like a natural cycle in some ways that
Right.
has to fall. So you're always looking, it makes you look around yourself, right? And see like, okay, what stage are we at right now?
Yes, it's kind of like the hero's journey. The hero's
Yeah,
journey
absolutely.
that you have embedded within movies like Star Wars or 2001: A Space Odyssey, or even embedded within Tolkien, for instance. This
Mhm.
idea that Joseph Campbell created is that you have this hero's journey, that you leave home and you have a great conquest or thing that you have to overcome, that you eventually circle back and that you are the hero. And that's how
Mhm.
heroes are made. That there is only one template, really, for how a hero is
Yeah.
produced, and that all myth can be distilled down into this archetypal construction. And the idea that all civilizations do X, Y, and Z is extremely reductive, but
Yeah.
also extremely attractive to us as humans.
Oh, we love simple stories.
Right.
Yeah.
If we could just understand where we are in the cycle, then we could save us.
Mhm.
And also, as we see frequently, it is a way to demonize and marginalize groups of people
Yes.
that we don't, and not myself particularly, but that certain people do not want to include within the
Yeah.
society that we are living in. So,
Yeah.
weaponizing that same narrative is, I think, very important to some people as well.
Yeah, you see the persistently, right, with the demonization, especially of outsiders, right? The story, the narrative, really incorrect about kind of late Rome, about barbarian invasions, right? Is just
Yes.
another bad person, another bad group out there who are going to destroy our way of life, and how seductive that is for contemporary politics, both in Gibbon's time and in ours as well. So that does make me want to ask, because we've been talking about kind of narratives as well. So, like, what is a better way then of thinking about the 4th, 5th, 6th century kind of Roman world if it's not kind of collapse, if we shouldn't accept Gibbon on his face, and not to say that Gibbon was entirely wrong, right? But that he
Right.
was telling a type of story. So what are these advances in kind of late antiquity that are making us rethink kind of this period of what some scholars are calling kind of transition or transformation?
Right. And I think the biggest thing is not to think about the Roman Empire as a homogenous entity, that we want to provide nuance and that we
Yeah.
want to understand that there are a lot of regional differences. And
Mhm.
this is something that has really been teased out by a lot of the authors that have been writing, especially in the past, I would say 60 years or so, 65 years, is that we see that in areas of North Africa, that there is a great amount of social and economic stability, even when the Vandals come through in the 5th century, for instance. And yes, Augustine is killed as the Vandals come into the city, but we have a lot of evidence that there's still a lot of wealth in certain provinces of the Roman Empire. The Romans pull out of Britannia, they pull out of Britain in 410. That's the same year that Rome gets sacked. Britain doesn't fall to pieces just because
No.
the Roman Empire has now receded and all the soldiers have gone home,
Mhm.
right? That we still have an economy within Britain. We understand that, especially in the West, a lot of that economy is downgrading, that it is receding, it is becoming smaller and more localized, so that we have areas that we would call Francia that are a little bit stronger in terms of their economy and they're much more networked. And then we have cities that are still surviving and doing well, like Ravenna, for instance.
Mhm.
But then we have places, yes, that are suffering, that very much have changed in terms of character. We have Spain, which is still doing quite well, but is now Visigothic. But
Mhm.
Visigothic Spain continues a lot of the Roman mores and
Yeah.
legislation that they had under Rome.
Yeah.
But if we look to the East, which I think most people are really more and more trying to understand Byzantine history, or what we call Byzantine history, but most people who do it are now simply calling Eastern Mediterranean history. We see a totally different story that most people don't engage with until they get to about the First Crusade.
Yeah.
Yes, many people know that the Byzantine Empire continued on until 1453, but they aren't very invested in understanding any emperor after about Justinian, I would say, in 565. And when he dies, they see this as the end of the Roman Empire, when in fact we have so many amazing developments in literature and tons of Greek manuscripts that tell us a lot about this extremely important, nuanced culture within the Byzantine world. And I think that the biggest mistake is simply seeing the fall as together a huge Roman Empire that is all falling collectively. And it's much more difficult to say, okay, we have a decline here, we have a transition here, we
Yes.
have people sustaining their culture here, right? That Egypt is a little bit different than what is going on the Italic Peninsula. People don't want to nuance things and understand the individual details. What they want to see is a story that is compelling, but also terrifying.
Yes.
The fear is part of what makes it so retold over and over again, because we're feeling an incredible amount of anxiety and angst in our hearts right now and in our chests.
Mm-hmm.
Every day we're walking out into the world wondering if we can stop some of the things that are happening in this world. And by saying, oh, get rid of immigrants and then everything will be better, it's so attractive to have a scapegoat, but that's exactly what it is.
And historical precedent, right? Like, you know, that it seems like if only they had done this and if we know that information now, and now we can do these things.
And it legitimizes your bigotry. Right?
And absolutely. Yeah. It gives you a long history to kind of draw on. It kind of absolves you. Like, I'm just following, you know, tradition precedent.
I'm not a racist. I'm not a bigot. Look, the Romans thought the same thing. And if they had known before, then I'm just the canary in the coal mine here, sir. And that is one of the defenses is that you use historical precedent. Remember Aristotle, remember Plutarch, right? To use those individuals as a way of justifying your actions is something that has been happening for many hundreds of years.
You know, I love what you said about kind of nuancing, because it's always seems like it really is the historian's job to say, no matter what, like, no, whatever you're thinking, no, it's more complicated than that, right? Like, it's just, it's not a simple story. It's never a simple story. It's always more complicated than that. I was looking at a piece on movement of coins between the 4th and the like 8th or 9th century or something like that. And, you know, there's still a lot of things moving in that period, but they're shifting where they're coming from and where they're going to, like you were saying. So absolutely, it's very clear that there's certain periods which are becoming economically impoverished, that they're being cut off from places, and there's other places that are just taking up the slack. And that's really bad in some cases, and it's better in other places, but it's just different. And different doesn't necessarily mean kind of worse or better. It just means we need to understand, like, well, why did it move over here, and why did these things happen in these ways? And that's what I think hopefully we can get at when we're talking about this period, is like, there are lots of things happening, and it is a big moment, but it's a moment in which we can understand if we just pay attention to the specificity of different peoples and places that are, you know, experiencing these things, right?
Absolutely. We would never speak of American history and even the current moment monolithically, like across the United States, X or Y is happening. Like currently, I think Iowa is like 48th or 49th in terms of economic growth, right? And you cannot compare Iowa to what's going on in California, to what's going on in Texas, to what's going on in New York, right? You have to understand Iowa on a local level. You have to understand our politics. You have to understand what sustains us, that we are very much an agrarian state. We have more pigs than people. But people tend to focus on and publish about New York and California and a certain group of people, right? And so there is always a place for the micro history and the local history, because that is where we are recovering the lives of individual people. And again, it's about extending dignity through detail and through nuance, is that we've given it to the rich people, and now we need to give it to the poor people. And I would say that when we look at the late Roman Empire, that providing detail and nuance may not be as neat and as finished and polished as it is to simply say, well, kick out all the immigrants and solve inflation and then we will save America. That is something that is a soundbite. But as we know, it is about the day-to-day work of policy and the day-to-day work of improving systems and improving the lives of people. That is what makes change. Like, change does not happen overnight. That is incremental. So why would we not think the same thing about history?
Yeah.
That change is incremental usually. I mean, yes, you have the sacking of Rome, the city, in 410 and 455, but Romans continue to occupy the city. They're
They
not like
sure did.
all dead, okay? They're still there.
Yeah.
And so providing this idea of detail and the idea that everybody deserves to be seen in the round as multidimensional figures is something that I think historians are trying very hard to do. But having a one-dimensional analysis like the fall of the Roman Empire that you can write in 1,000 words for an op-ed that gets run in the Wall Street Journal for the 50th time is something that many people will read and go, ah, yes, it's as easy as I thought. It's as easy as I thought, right? Because they don't want to go to community meetings. They don't want to come together at a union and unionize. All of these things are hard work and take an incredible amount of day-to-day commitment. So I also think it's laziness.
Yeah. It's because it's, I mean, like saying like for the 50th time is like, yeah, there's just so many and they're all the same. They're all the same. They're all the same argument again and again and again. And they haven't done any of the reading. And it's just so clear.
Right. But you remember that it is also a dog whistle to each other.
Oh, yeah.
They are speaking in a vocabulary that is both aesthetic and literary that they recognize that has a meaning beyond simply what they're saying, which is to say, I wish to return to a conservative earlier period of time. We'll use the time machine again to say simply, as a woman, I would never want to travel back to the period of the Roman Empire. But I also think that, as Chris Rock very famously talked about, that most people of color would never get in a time machine altogether. Right? That a lot of Afrofuturism and a lot of understanding of the future is that people of color can make the future better and more inhabitable for them. And a lot of history has not been particularly kind or uplifting to non-white folks. And if we go back to the Roman Empire, we have emperors that were African. We have empresses that are Syrian. We have a huge cosmopolitan mix of people within the ancient Mediterranean. But we also have a lot of bigotry and ethnic slurs as well, and a lot of hostility between people as well. There is no time period that is perfect. And so thinking that the Roman Empire is the place that you want to travel to and that you want to return to as a white guy living in the year 2025 is not something that all other people agree on or want to support. It's certainly not a place that I would want to visit.
It is a statement about your modern politics in many ways. So
yes, I think that the question of what period of time you would travel to in the past, the present, or the future is extremely telling about who you are and the rights that you currently or would have.
Yeah. On that note, I would stay put. I would not use any time machine ever to do anything.
It's too dangerous. I only want to watch Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. That's the only time machine that I condone is if George Carlin is taking me in it.
I think that's fair. I would, yes, absolutely. Bill and Ted, they seem to have gotten time travel correct. It went a little, it went a little awry at times over the course of the three movies, but they fixed it at the end. So anyway, on that end, with a hearty endorsement from both Sarah and I think to go out and watch Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure as soon as possible, we'll bring this to an end. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. This has been a really wonderful, fantastic conversation, and it's really delightful that we have this new perspective that you were kind of, talking to us about, not a new perspective, but reminding us that there are other people in the world other than the kind of super rich people. I think that's really important.
Yeah. And when we come together, we are stronger together, that there is strength in a union. And I am not abashed to say that this book is very much supporting people who want to come together, who see the power in collective action.
Mm-hmm. And improving people's lives.
Exactly.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
No.
So, no. Okay. All right. Thank you again, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you to all of our listeners for joining us on this new episode of American Medieval. And until next week, take care. We'll see you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.